Slideshow, design, slideshow, custom slideshow, week 4. Hi, everybody. Welcome to AE911Truth Webinars, where we are looking at what really happened at the World Trade Center. I'm Richard Gage, AIA, architect, member of the American Institute of Architects, and founder of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. And we're delighted to have you come back today as we focus on week 4, what really happened at the World Trade Center towers, specifically the Twin Towers. First, a little bit about myself. I've been an architect for about 29 years, worked on many different types of fireproof steel frame buildings and other types of buildings, including these gymnasiums, $3 million gymnasiums in the San Francisco Bay Area, the construction administration for this $125 million high school in the Bay Area, and more recently in the Las Vegas area, this $400 million project with 6 blocks of retail and 1,200 tons of fireproof steel framing, including a couple of mid-rise structures here. And I'm joined by 2,500. We have 2,700 now. We keep getting more because we keep going to the conventions of the American Institute of Architects and educating architects at the grassroots level. We show them the information you're going to be seeing today, and they end up agreeing, yeah, we didn't know about any of this, or much of it. Particularly the Building 7, which we have focused on in the conventions, the third worst structural failure in modern history. World Trade Center Building 7, 47-story skyscraper that we focused on in weeks 1 and 2 of this 4-part webinar series. And so last week we focused on an introduction to the Twin Towers, how they came down, what was the official story. This week, we're going to be focusing on week 4, and that is the evidence of extreme heat, which most architects know nothing about as well, including myself before I became aware. Back in 2006, I was listening to the radio. I heard David Ray Griffin being interviewed on a radio station there in Berkeley by Bonnie Faulkner of Guns and Butter. That's the program, and she has been fearlessly putting out information that even KPFA, the mother station of her program, has a hard time with. And 9/11 is one of those, because 9/11 brings us this kind of evidence that we don't see in the mainstream media, that we have to go to sources on the internet largely that actually take the evidence from official sources. Everything you're seeing today and more, most of what you're seeing today is from official sources, and there will be more. Iron microspheres from the U.S. Geological Survey, molten steel and iron from the first responders, the iron workers, pyroclastic-like clouds evident in all the videos, nanothermite, which is a high-tech form of thermite, and this evidence and this molten iron is found and documented very clearly in the rubble piles, the debris piles in the basements. It's a fascinating look today. But let's begin at the beginning, just so we can get on the same page, find out what happened that day and how the development of this official story started.
On September 11th, we learned that 4 passenger planes were hijacked and taken radically off course. Within an hour, 2 of the planes had flown into the enormous steel towers of the World Trade Center, creating fires and eventually toppling them. Dazed by the news, the American public soon believed the fires in the towers had burned so hot they caused the steel frames of the buildings to give way. A myth developed, fed by official sources through the media to a bewildered audience. Elements of the myth. The impact of the airplanes, gallons of burning jet fuel, steel melting, the buildings failing and suddenly imploding. In a mere 10 seconds, 110 stories hurtled earthward, pulverizing into dust. Right from the start, on the street itself, the official story was born.
Come out of nowhere and just scream right into the side of the Twin Tower, exploding through the other side. And then I witnessed both towers collapse, one first and then the second, mostly due to structural failure because the fire was just too intense.
The myth bled into the FEMA report and was echoed by the experts.
It was the combination of the impact load doing great damage to the building, followed by the fire, that caused collapse.
Well, here we have it, right from the gentleman on the street. The first day, the first gentleman interviewed, the official story. And that did, in fact, bleed into the engineers like Gene Corley here, who wrestled with others for a year to collaborate and end up agreeing with the gentleman in the Fox News hat. And we are going to question that official story today. And we're going to apply the scientific method. That's what we focus on at AE911Truth. We have a question: what brought the towers down? So we try to formulate that question. We do some background research. We make observations. We construct a hypothesis, our best guess as to what brought the towers down. All the hypotheses are put on the table. I think they came down by fire. No, I think they came down by controlled demolition. Maybe something else. Maybe the plane impacts. So all of these are laid out and analyzed objectively, because the scientific method helps us winnow error from truth, fact from fiction. We test those predictions that are made based on those hypotheses with experiments. We analyze the results and draw conclusions. If the hypothesis is corroborated, we report the results in an open, transparent manner, so all can build on the body of our work. That's how the scientific method works. That's how we have a body of science dating back more than 100 years. If the hypothesis is not corroborated, we go back and construct another hypothesis, one that stands a better chance against the data. So with this in mind, let's proceed and apply the scientific method. So we find that there are indeed features of controlled demolition that we looked at in our earlier weeks of this webinar series. We have a sudden onset of destruction, usually at the base of the structure, a straight down symmetrical collapse into its own footprint. 3 demolition waves remove column supports. This results in a free fall acceleration straight down through the path of what was the greatest resistance. The total dismemberment of the steel structure, broken up, ready for loading and shipment. Number 6, minimal damage to adjacent structures. Number 7, sounds and flashes of explosives heard and seen by witnesses. Number 8, enormous clouds of pulverized concrete and isolated explosive ejections in number 9 called squibs. This is all evidence of explosive destruction, along with chemical evidence of cutter charges, number 10, certainly. If you have this, you have direct evidence of explosive destruction, and fire can't create any one of these, let alone all of them, in our belief. With additional corroborating and circumstantial evidence, government documentation, experts agreeing, at least those experts who don't have biases, financial imperatives to side with one side of the controversy or another. Those with $100,000 federal contracts, for instance. So we'll be looking at other experts. Foreknowledge of the destruction. It takes months, of course, to place, plant, engineer, and explosive demolition. Video documentation, all of this is proof of controlled demolition. And this is what we're going to be looking at today. Not just with the features of classic controlled demolition, but additional features of very unique controlled demolition, and not that controlled, as we'll see, or as we saw last week in explosive destruction. In fact, last week we looked at the first 8 key characteristics. Today we're going to be looking at the evidence of extreme heat, beginning with pyroclastic-like clouds, as we look first at the National Fire Protection Association Guide for Investigation of Fire and Explosions, guide number 921, which encourages investigators to look for thermal effects. Now, this was not done, as we'll see, by NIST, who took over the investigation from FEMA early on and ejected, as we saw in week 1 of this webinar, ejected from the final report of Building 7, for instance, the entire metallurgical analysis of the steel, which documented hot corrosion and sulfuric corrosion and molten iron invading the steel. This is direct evidence of thermite. And thermite is an incendiary, as we found that week, which cuts through steel like a hot knife through butter. So I encourage you, by the way, to look at the previous webinars if you're new to this series. This is number 4 in a series, and you can go on our website at AE911Truth.org, click on the webinar banner in the lower right corner as you scroll down, and you will find all of our archives there. So it encourages us, the NFPA 921, to look for large volumes of gas and the large amount of heat released in chemical explosions, causing rapidly expanding plumes of hot gases. And this is indeed observable before, during, and directly after the final destruction. Let's take a look. You can begin to see these cauliflower-shaped plumes expanding by the vast hot gases already in the pulverization of all the concrete, which we looked at last week. And you can see the incredible, massive, unfolding cauliflower-shaped plumes, which is a direct result of massive heat, much more heat than was available in these fires, because these fires were going out, especially in the South Tower, where we looked at its destruction and fire last week. So this is direct evidence of massive quantities of heat, and that can be actually, the expansion of that heat has been calculated by Jim Hoffman at 911research.com. You can look at that there. And so we certainly need an investigation of this phenomena alone. They're not caused by fires or gravitational collapses, these expanding cauliflower-shaped plumes. It's intense heat from the gases, or from what we'll see is not necessarily explosions. In this case, we saw evidence of explosions last week. In this case, incendiaries is the evidence we're looking at. And part of that is found in number 9, the extreme heat producing iron microspheres, pools of molten iron. This extreme heat was documented very clearly by many, including Bechtel, 2,800 degree temperatures. Well, jet fuel, according to its manufacturer, burns at about 600 degrees Fahrenheit. And NIST claims, well, these fires got up to 1,800 degrees. Well, most fires, and especially these fires, which fall into the category of 500, maybe 1,000 degree fires is all. Let's say NIST is correct, though, in claiming 1,800 degree fires, but even though they have no evidence. In fact, the evidence that they do have for the temperatures in their fires doesn't exceed 600 degrees based on their metallurgical paint analysis from steel samples selected due to their proximity of the jet plane impacts. So yes, no evidence, but let's give it to them. Still, this is 1,000 times hotter than the NIST claim of how hot the fires were. So what can produce this? This is about the melting point of iron or steel, 2,800 degrees. So now you can see iron or steel doesn't melt in fires. It can't. It's only half the temperatures, usually quarter of the temperature required to melt steel. And yet, Leslie Robertson's associate, Richard Garlock, documents the debris past the columns was red hot, molten, running. Well, let's listen to some of the other on-site people. Saw pools of literally molten steel, says Peter Tully, president of the Tully Construction. They cleaned up the site, dripping from the molten steel, regarding the steel beam from this firefighter. Seeing the molten steel, uncovering red-hot metal beams excavated from beneath. Well, molten material, molten iron, as it turns out, is pouring out of the side of the South Tower minutes prior to its collapse. We can tell what the temperature of this material is by its color and its brightness. In fact, NIST says, oh, that must be melted airplane. Well, melted aluminum doesn't glow bright orange, bright yellow in daylight conditions, as you can see here. So it's not molten aluminum. It's not molten lead from batteries. Same problem. Molten metal still red hot weeks after the event. Molten steel at the heart of the tower's remains, says this firefighter. Molten steel beams. Streams of molten metal leaked from the hot cores flow down. None of this information, by the way, is in the official report. All of these witnesses, metal dripping from a beam, dripping molten steel, says this officer, this corporation. You can see the molten steel or iron, as it turns out to be, dripping out of the material held in the crab claw from this excavator. Steel members in the debris pile that appear to have been partly evaporated in extraordinarily high temperatures, says Jonathan Barnett, fire protection engineer, author of the FEMA report, especially Appendix C, the metallurgical examination of this very steel. Partially evaporated. That takes 4,000 degrees to evaporate steel. That's its boiling point. Where did 4,000 degree temperatures come from? We're going to show you a very likely source. And here you can see the evaporation, the melting of steel in this beam from World Trade Center 7, found by Abolhassan Astani Hazel from he had access to the Freshkills landfill due to a National Science Foundation grant that he was given to do an independent study. Well, here is the Appendix C, which documents steel that has been corroded, looking like Swiss cheese, intergranular melting. They've never seen this before in fires. First responders, fire protection engineers have not seen this. Eutectic reactions, let's look at that. But this piece of WTC7 steel is completely melted, corroded, and they find rapid oxidation, sulfidation, intergranular melting. So sulfidation, there's sulfur added to this material. Where did the sulfur come from? NIST says, well, NIST is the National Institute of Standards and Technology, who was tasked by Congress to explain these collapses to the American people. They say, well, gypsum board, it has sulfur in them. No, that's calcium sulfate. It doesn't release. It's bonded. It isn't, and by the way, it has never turned around and attacked the steel, which it is used to protect for the last 100 years or so. A liquid eutectic mixture containing primarily iron, oxygen, sulfur, formed in this hot corrosion attack on the steel. Now, this metallurgical examination was completely rejected by NIST when they took over the investigation from FEMA in 2002. But prior to that, it was very well documented as Appendix C in May of 2002 report by FEMA. Every time I breathed it in, it burned. The smell of sulfur. That's what they're smelling out there. Where was all the sulfur coming from? We're going to take a look at that. And here you see the metallurgical analysis documenting the deepest mystery uncovered in the investigation, the presence of sulfur, iron sulfide in this eutectic mixture. Sulfur is used, by the way, with thermite. Thermite is an incendiary used by the military to cut through steel like a hot knife through butter. Sulfur increases its capacity. And apparently, concrete was melted as well, as this large chunk is found. Molten concrete melts at 3,200 degrees, wrapping itself around this police handgun. Where do these temperatures come from? Not from the official story, nor this.
One of the more unusual artifacts to emerge from the rubble is this rock-like object that has come to be known as the meteorite.
It's this fused element of steel, molten steel and concrete and all of these things all fused by the heat. And architects, engineers, people who work with steel, welders have just never seen the level of destruction and the level of deformation of this material in our lives.
But there it is, and yet it's unexplained. Well, this material, these meteorites, they're not aluminum or lead, they don't rust. So it's got iron in it, clearly. And in fact, the flights overhead from the infrared sensitive camera thermal mapping by NASA shows temperatures exceeding what normal office fires provide. And these are temperatures, 1,300 degrees at Building 7, 1,160 and 1,377 at World Trade Center 2. These are temperatures on the surface. Now, there's no fires on the surface 5 days after 9/11. The fires are several stories below in the basements of the World Trade Center and underneath the bottom of the rubble pile, Building 7. How can surface temperatures read as hotter than most office fires when there's no fire? Because what is radiating from that way down deep below is much, much hotter than any normal office fire. And indeed, you saw what that was, molten material. But that is denied by John Gross from the NIST report, lead author of the NIST report. Let's listen.
First of all, let's go back to your basic premise that there was a pool of molten steel. I know of absolutely nobody, no eyewitness who said so, nobody who's produced it.
You get down below and you see molten steel running down the channel rails, like you're in a foundry.
Yeah.
Like lava.
Actually melted beams where it was molten steel that was being dug out.
Underground, it was still so hot that molten metal dripped down the sides of a wall.
The cleanup was very difficult in the beginning. Steel was coming out red in certain areas from the first couple of weeks.
This fused element of steel, molten steel.
And they pulled out the big block of concrete, and there was like a little river of steel flowing.
A river of steel flowing. This is Leslie Robertson, the structural engineer of the World Trade Center, documenting his witnessing of flowing molten steel, as he calls it. The difference between molten steel and molten iron is he's unable, as most would be, to tell the difference just by observing it. but the tests of this material that John Gross has found partially evaporated beams, evidence itself of extreme temperatures exceeding 4,000 degrees in this case. The test results show elemental iron. That's different than steel. And that's what we looked at in that metallurgical analysis. So here's the very piece that was used by FEMA in their Appendix C in May of 2002, and which John Gross himself rejected from the final NIST report. But his shadow is all over the evidence. What about these temperatures? Well, those supporters of the official story say maybe 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit, the fires at the World Trade Center, Twin Towers. But structural steel doesn't even melt till 2,700 degrees, and that's what we've been seeing evidence of. What can create that? Well, we're going to be looking at thermite, which can indeed create temperatures exceeding 4,000 degrees. Let's take a look at the evidence of thermate in the World Trade Center piles, which would be cutter charges. Normally in controlled demolitions, they use high energy explosives. This is appearing to be a different animal here. So let's take a look and see if thermite could have produced all that molten metal. And what is thermite anyway?
An incendiary used by the military, thermite is a compound of iron oxide and aluminum, which when ignited sustains an extreme heat reaction, creating molten iron. In just 2 seconds, thermite can reach temperatures over 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit, quite enough to liquefy steel. We know that open-air fires cannot burn hot enough to melt steel, but metal had melted at the base of the towers. Appendix C of the FEMA report describes sulfur residues on the World Trade Center steel. The New York Times called this the deepest mystery of all. Sulfur slightly lowers the melting point of iron, and iron oxide and iron sulfide had formed on the surface of the structural steel. Sulfur used with thermite is called thermate, producing even faster results.
Fascinating. So here is a material that, if we find the evidence for it, could account for the massive quantities of molten iron and the heat produced therefrom, could account for the sulfur, which is added to thermite to become thermate. It could account for a lot of the evidence that we've just seen. Well, NIST says we didn't find any evidence of explosives or residues of explosives or incendiaries, they clarified. They put that out in writing, and they later acknowledge in writing that they never looked for it. How can you find what you're not looking for? And they refuse to look for it still, although the evidence is abundant, as you'll see. Other independent scientists did. Here's one, Dr. Stephen Jones, a nuclear physicist. He notes that if you had thermite, you would be looking for common elements such as iron, aluminum, copper, calcium, silicon, but more unusual elements such as fluorine and manganese left behind in the residue. These elements in the periodic table that we all learned about, well, somebody sent him a chunk from this 40-pound piece of molten material. So here it is again, molten metal. What is it? Is it lead? Is it aluminum? What is it? Well, it's predominantly iron, and that's elemental iron. So he rules out it's not aluminum, clearly, not from the jet planes. It has abundant manganese, so it's not melted steel. It is elemental iron with abundant manganese. It has small amounts of aluminum, sulfur, potassium. Interesting. From elements you'd associate with thermite. But even more importantly, manganese and fluorine in abundance. Wow, fascinating. Why? Well, fluorine is used in sol gel type thermite charges. Very interesting. Manganese is from the potassium permanganate, commonly used as an oxidizer in thermite. So these are often present in the residue, and they are indeed part of a thermite fingerprint. Well, a second sample comes from this sculpture from the World Trade Center, and he sent a piece of slag clinging to the end of this partially evaporated beam. X-ray fluorescence he does on it shows that there's iron, sulfur, potassium, manganese. And this piece from the International Peace Garden in Manitoba shows a very jagged cut that is not associated with oxyacetylene torches that are used at the site by the iron workers for cutting. This is a very clean cut with a highly efficient device that is used for cutting steel by iron workers. But this is something else with aluminum slag also on the end here. So something else is going on. And this piece, and that is from the International Peace Park in Manitoba. And zooming in on this piece, you also see lots of aluminum left behind. So the XED analysis indeed, again, shows manganese, iron, aluminum, sulfur, silicon, carbon, what you would expect in this type of use of thermite. Now, you can build a thermite cutter charge, which is what it would take. You don't just pour thermite up against a beam like they did in the National Geographic special, which was designed to try to debunk these so-called conspiracy theories. But what do? They pour a bunch of thermite against the beam. No, what you have to do is build a shaped cutter charge, which this civil engineer did in his backyard. Watch. And indeed, it cut straight through the web and the flanges of that beam, rendering the ends of it looking razor sharp, which he cuts a carrot on. So that's pretty darn important. And we note that there are even higher tech devices patented prior to 9/11, which are designed to issue molten iron, cutting through much thicker steel even than high energy explosives can cut through. This one cuts through in hundreds of milliseconds, much more effective, very expensive though. And indeed, there are cutter charges which their casing, the very casing of them is made out of consolidated thermite. So all that's left behind in the residue from such devices would be pools of molten iron. Well, sol gels, a very special type of thermite, would also leave behind a certain residue, 1,3-diphenyl propane. And in fact, one molecule was present at levels that dwarfed all others, according to the EPA, 1,3-diphenyl propane. We've never observed it in any other sampling we've ever done, says Eric Schwartz of the EPA. Well, that needs to be followed up on, certainly, but they didn't explain that one either. Nor did they explain what was found in all of this powder, 4-inch thick river-to-river, 3-square-mile area, 30% of which is concrete pulverized to 100 microns. It's fine ash, actually, is what it was like. How did that happen? We talked about that last week. This week, we're looking at what's found by the USGS and R.J. Lee, an independent environmental consulting firm doing toxicological studies on the dust. What do they find? Small spherical iron particles resulting from the melting of iron. It's elemental iron, as you see there in the lower right here. Elemental iron. Fascinating. These are spheres which are about the size of the diameter of a human hair, almost naked to the eye, but they're in all the World Trade Center dust samples. The USGS finds them everywhere. In fact, together they classify the dust as World Trade Center dust, and uniquely as such because of these very iron spherical particles, which are unexplained, but which are in abundance. In fact, up to 6% of many of the samples, most of the samples, are composed of these unexplained, previously molten iron droplets. As we discussed, molten iron achieves that state only at about 2,800 degrees or more Fahrenheit. So yes, it's a signature component. It's not even World Trade Center dust unless it has these unexplained, previously molten iron droplets, found by several, including physicist Stephen Jones, and documented in his fine work, Extreme Temperatures in the World Trade Center Dust. R.J. Lee does a very detailed background, a study, and they find it's not background particles. Background iron particles are not spherical. They didn't sustain molten iron temperatures. And they're not elemental iron. So iron spheres are found throughout the dust, and here's how they can be produced. So here is a very detailed experiment lighting thermite, and its byproduct is molten iron and aluminum oxide gas. Molten iron is dispersed due to the pressure, and it cools and falls in the same state. All of these molten iron sphericals, which cool and fall, and all of the surrounding cars. The question has been raised, well, how did these cars get toasted? Well, how about falling molten iron droplets? This was a very hot event. Plenty of witnesses describing the heat as they were chased from this cloud. But what else was found in this World Trade Center dust? Well, in the apartment of Jeanette McKinley and 7 other sources, 4 of which were finally collected, analyzed, documented in a peer-reviewed paper, they found iron red-gray chips. Red on one side, gray on the other. The red side contains iron. It comes up to a magnet. And they get real curious about this because they are not looking like paint. So they zoom in and do an X-ray energy dispersive spectroscopy analysis and find the ingredients of thermite: iron, aluminum, silicon, oxygen, carbon. They get real curious now. What is the ingredients of thermite doing in these curious chips, the largest of which is about 1/16 of an inch in diameter? Because like the concrete, everything was pulverized, as we saw last week. Even the desks and chairs are unrecognizable, cubicles, computers, file cabinets, everything was pulverized. So everything except the steel, of course, which, as we discussed last week, was completely shattered. One beam from a column all the way down 110 stories. But the scientists zoom into the red layer, getting real curious, 50,000 times with a nuclear microscope. And they find these amazing nano-sized particles of iron oxide crystals, rhomboidal-shaped elemental iron pieces, 1,000 times smaller than a human hair. And these aluminum platelets set in a bed of oxygen, silica, and carbon. So here are the ingredients of thermite: iron oxide and aluminum powders. But at this scale, engineered extremely small size, an incendiary that's engineered to become more explosive because of the organic material which it is set in. Fascinating. Now, this has been documented before by researchers at about 420 degrees centigrade, it ignites. And indeed, that's exactly what these chips did. Just like their predecessors here documented at Lawrence Livermore Lab. This is called super-thermite. We know about it. It's been discussed in the literature. And so just like that, all four of these samples ignited. And what do they produce when they're ignited? They produce the same spheres that are produced, are found in the World Trade Center dust by others. So we know where those spheres came from in the World Trade Center dust. They came from those chips. And the chemical analysis reveals the same as well. It's consistent, as if we didn't know, because these spheres are actually found in abundance attached to these partially ignited red-gray chips like this, as found in the dust samples. It's very clear. It's an internally consistent, self-corroborating set of evidence that needs to find its way into the court system. And we have a goal of doing just that. And I'll tell you about our September conference with a dozen attorneys, high-level attorneys, assembling in New York on September 10th and 11th for this purpose. We'll talk about that in a moment. But you can see the gravity of the situation. Here is evidence of nanothermite in the World Trade Center dust, completely ignored by NIST, ridiculed by others. The evidence of super-thermite, which is a history of analysis and publications from Lawrence Livermore Lab, from Los Alamos Lab. You see, when you reduce the size of these highly reactive particles of thermite to nanoscale, the volume increases enormously. So the chemical reaction occurs almost instantaneously, which, along with the organic bed in which it's set, creates an explosive. The power of incendiaries far exceed, in terms of their energy capacity, exceed explosives. When you design them to be explosive, you have amazing results. And that's why millions and millions of dollars were poured into this by our defense, let's call them the offense department. No, I won't get political. Our contracting agencies that create this material for very good reason. Well, in their minds. We'll leave that analysis to others. But we have here a peer-reviewed paper, 25 pages in the Bentham Open Chemical Physics Journal, that has not been contested. The way to contest somebody's, theory is to put forth your own peer-reviewed paper, challenging. This has not been done. And so it stands uncontested in the peer-reviewed sense. That's how you don't just wave your hand and say, hey, that's paint. Well, paint doesn't have those exotic properties. And the destruction of the World Trade Center doesn't exhibit the evidence of destruction by fire. It exhibits the evidence of destruction of explosives. In this case, incendiaries is what we've been focusing on. And with additional data from the NIST and FEMA reports, such as the FEMA investigation, which Bill Manning, editor-in-chief of Fire Engineering magazine, calls a half-baked farce that may already have been commandeered by political forces whose primary interests, to put it mildly, lie far afield of full disclosure. The structural damage from the planes and the explosive ignition of the jet fuel in themselves were not enough to bring down the towers. But he was ignored. Instead, a $20 million effort to document NIST's theory of how these towers collapsed ensued, with massive 10,000-page obfuscation, which completely avoided the collapse itself, which is what they were tasked by Congress to explain to the American people. But in a footnote, they say the focus of the investigation was on the sequence of events from the instant of aircraft impact to the initiation of collapse. What? You stopped your entire investigation at the initiation of collapse and didn't try to tell us what happened after that? It doesn't actually include the structural behavior of the tower after the conditions for collapse initiation were reached. And then they claim collapse became inevitable. Well, this is not rocket science. Structural engineers do this every day for a living. They know how to calculate the ability of the cold, hard, intact steel below the point of jet plane impacts to resist some collapsing or colliding body above it. And we looked at this last week very, very carefully with Newton's third law, equal and opposite reaction. The top part of the Twin Towers, we decided, could not possibly destroy the cold, hard, intact steel below. But with 10,000 pages of obfuscation and irrelevant detail and modeling life safety issues far more than any analysis, there's only a 1/2 page discussion. It's actually speculation on the events following collapse initiation. Here it is. The structure below the level of collapse initiation offered minimal resistance. The large building mass far exceeded the capacity of the intact structure below to absorb that through the energy of deformation. Well, the energy of deformation, as we saw last week, would have slowed the near free fall collapse of this structure to, if it collapsed at all, it would have taken minutes, not a dozen seconds, as if there was no structure whatsoever below it. And they even acknowledge it came down essentially in free fall. The floors below were unable to arrest the moving mass. Well, they had to have been removed by something in order to not impede any collapse whatsoever. They were rendered incapable of resisting hardly at all. It collapsed in an acceleration straight down, faster and faster, not even decelerating through the path of what should have been the greatest resistance. So this is not an analysis. This is mere speculation on their part. This should have not been called the final report on the collapse of the Twin Towers. Probably should have called it the final report on the initiation of collapse. And when challenged by members of AE911Truth and family members and others, they acknowledge in response to this request for correction, we were unable to provide a full explanation of the total collapse of the Twin Towers. Well, they were unable to provide any explanation of the collapse, much less the total collapse, shattering every structural steel element from another all the way down to the ground in 12 seconds. What do the experts say? Again, those experts who are not paid by the federal government to provide a opinion in their favor. Here's Ron Brookman, one of 100 structural engineers among the 2,500 architects and engineers, signed on to the petition publicly, which I'm inviting all of you to do. Doesn't look anything like a heat-induced collapse, heat-induced gravitational collapse mechanism. Why complete collapse of the Twin Towers became inevitable, as NIST speculates, makes no sense. Why would all 110 stories drop straight to the ground in 10 seconds, pulverizing the contents to dust and twisted steel? Some people say 10 seconds, some people say 12, some people say 15. It's somewhere in that range. There's so much dust, it's hard to tell. But another one of the structural engineers challenging the official story says the prevailing theory would have us believe that each of the Twin Towers inexplicably collapsed upon itself, crushing all 287 massive columns on each floor, while maintaining a near freefall acceleration, as if the 100,000 or more tons of supporting structural steel framework underneath didn't even exist. David Scott, structural engineer. Near freefall collapse violates laws of physics. Yeah, that's clear, clean. A child can understand that. Fire protection engineer Scott Granger. All three collapses were very uniform in nature. Natural collapses due to unplanned events are not uniform. And we saw last week how the firemen described the belts of these explosions like a belt all the way around the building, like a belt, one after another. That's uniformity. Edward Muniak, another fire protection engineer. These collapses have no resemblance to any previous high-rise fire. Well, indeed, we saw last week, no high-rise fire, and there's been 100 of them at least, has ever brought down a high-rise, except on 9/11, where we have not just the two we're talking about today, but the third tower that we talked about in weeks 1 and 2. Even co-author of the FEMA report, Mathis Levy, says it looks like a managed demolition. Let's see.
You've seen many of the managed demolitions where they implode a building and they cause it essentially to fall vertically because they cause all of the vertical columns to fail simultaneously. That's exactly what it looked like, and that's what happened.
Fascinating. Did that work into his final report as a member of the FEMA study team? No. Neither did the opinions of other FEMA who, before they got involved in producing an official report, had their own opinions. It appeared to me that charges had been placed in the building, says structural engineer Ronald Hamburger. Upon learning, though, that no bombs had been detonated, he says, I was very surprised. Well, how did he learn that no bombs had been detonated? And why would that change his opinion? Very interesting questions. We would like to have him subpoenaed as well. And his investigations never considered demolition, even though it appeared to him that charges had been placed in the building. Well, is the hypothesis corroborated for you from the results of today's focused attention on the extreme heat produced and documented at the World Trade Center Twin Towers? Have we shown in this week and last week, week 3 and 4, all key characteristics of explosive demolition and uncharacteristic features as well, like thermite, which is not normally used in explosive demolitions. Why, by the way? Well, it's very expensive. Thermite being very expensive would be a price you'd have to pay to avoid detection in a deceptive controlled demolition. Detection like the massive audio signature of high energy explosives like C4 and RDX, which are normally used in controlled demolitions. The visual signature of bright flashes, very visible. So in a deceptive controlled demolition, we would not expect that they would use those obvious methods. Do we have direct evidence of explosive destruction, therefore, in the last couple of weeks with respect to the Twin Towers? Can fire create any one of these, let alone all of them? Is there additional corroborating and circumstantial and video evidence of the Twin Towers that we've seen in the last 2 weeks? Is this proof to you of controlled demolition? Proof beyond a reasonable doubt? Does it raise questions? Does it make you want to get a new investigation, like the 2,700 of us who have already signed the petition? We invite you to do that now. Go onto the website, click sign the petition. At least sign up for our free monthly email newsletter. Become a member of AE911Truth. We have 2,000 members giving $2.50 a month minimum, and $5, $10 some. Can you afford that in order to bring this truth to the body of professionals across our country and around the world? This is a grassroots movement, and we are relying at the individual level. That's you. If you have questions like we do about this, donate to AE911Truth and volunteer. We have many different opportunities for you to do just that. In fact, Andy Steele, our operations coordinator, is here. Andy, do we have some volunteer opportunities?
Oh, we always do. I hope everybody can hear me okay. Because if you are moved by this evidence and you want to do something about it, as they say every week, we have projects going on. We're going to be having even more of them coming into the next year as we really take this evidence to the people that need to hear about it, professional organizations, members of Congress. And that is why we need to have as many people as possible, all hands on deck in this important issue here. So if you want to volunteer, just go up to this webpage, AE911Truth.org. You're probably on it already. Click the What You Can Do tab at the top, select volunteer, and you just fill out a quick form, and we will get in touch with you and get you to work. So,
fantastic. Thank you so much, Andy. And you'll be hearing more from Andy on 9/11 Freefall, the radio station which brings our experts and many others to thousands of people. And you can find 9/11 Freefall at noliesradio.org. Better even still, go to YouTube and search 9/11 Freefall. Is that right, Andy?
Yes, it is. You can also go to 911freefall.com. You can catch the archives there.
911freefall.com. Thanks, Andy. And so not only are we asking you to volunteer with AE911Truth, but locally in your own community, you can reach out. Send the AE911Truth.org link to elected representatives, television representatives, radio, newspaper, all the media, local media. Remember, this is a grassroots movement. We're not hearing about AE911Truth on the mainstream media, with a couple of exceptions. Through a lot of hard work on the part of our volunteers. It's a lot of work, and it takes you to break ground at the local level. So tell everyone you know, screen the DVDs, which we're going to show you, speak to new audiences yourself, share the AE911Truth resources. We have brochures, DVDs, hats and t-shirts, even for those that want to be real visible. We have a 55-page paper which just pulls apart the official story, provides all this evidence that we've been looking at, called Beyond Misinformation. And you can get it for free. It'll be emailed to you. Just click on the link below. You'll see it probably where you're listening right now on our website. But if not, go to our website, AE911Truth.org. Just click on sign up for our newsletter, and we will email you this 55-page PDF, Beyond Misinformation. 40,000 copies of this, 50 or 60 by now, I think, have been distributed, and 40,000 just to professionals all around the country. And we have completed a tour all around the country ourselves with our new film, Firefighters, Architects, Engineers, featuring Eric Lawyer, founder of Firefighters for 9/11 Truth and Unity, in which he goes through the National Fire Protection Association manual, showing all the negligent violations by NIST of this standard guideline used by fire department for fire and explosion investigation all around the world, actually. NIST even helped create that document. They didn't follow it. So 72 presentations we've done. You can see this film on YouTube for free. Firefighters, Architects, and Engineers. Just look for it. That's the 60-minute version. The 90-minute version, which has some incredible footage in it, is available at our store. Just click "What can you do?" at the top of our website, and you'll find it. You'll also find this DVD, 90-minute version, of which I'm going to play a 2-minute trailer for you and give you a sense of our landmark documentary documenting the evidence of Building 7 and the Twin Towers. Watch.
I don't want to be involved in conspiracy theories. You know, there are lots of them. They can go on. We can speculate on that forever. What we really need to know is how those buildings came down.
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires fueled by office furnishings. It did not collapse from explosives or from fuel oil fires.
To undermine scientific integrity is to undermine our democracy.
This is what NIST has done, denied and ignored crucial evidence.
The American people absolutely need the truth of 9/11.
More than 1,500 architects and engineers and 12,000 others, including many scientists, have signed the petition calling for a scientific investigation of the destruction of the Twin Towers and World Trade Center Building 7. The report, issued by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, referred to as NIST, was not valid science.
They're talking about a single columnar collapse or failure that resulted in a total collapse of the building.
Building number 7 descended in free fall for the first 100 feet, which means that there was absolutely no resistance to descent whatsoever.
So all of the columns really needed to be severed at the same time.
The symmetry is the smoking gun.
NIST has admitted it went into free fall for 8 stories.
You don't need to be an engineer or an architect to see what happened to those buildings.
Dit is controlled demolition. Zeker weten.
What I saw, it was a classic implosion. The center of the core, the penthouse area, starts to move first, and then the building follows along with it.
NIST excluded the documents from FEMA in Appendix C that documented the evidence of melting steel.
In an office fire, you cannot generate enough heat to melt steel.
There were these iron microspheres present in all of the dust samples. They needed to have been formed in extremely high temperatures.
All the characteristics of the microspheres, along with what I see in the attack of the beams that were actually found, tell me that thermite was involved.
In the dust, what we had found is a modern version of thermite, which we call nanothermite.
NIST concedes that they found no evidence for explosives. So then we asked them, well, did you look? And they said, no, we did not look for explosives or residues of explosives.
And in fact, the evidence is overwhelming that these red-grade crystals are very high-temperature incendiaries.
We have watched as scientific integrity has been undermined and scientific research politicized in an effort to advance predetermined ideological agendas.
If this is a crime, I think everybody agrees it's a crime. Evidence was removed from the scene of the crime. You can't do science when you are deprived of the evidence and when your hypothesis is the least valid instead of the most likely. And the most likely hypothesis in the case of Building 7 wasn't even mentioned. This is not science.
And yes, you can organize a screening of this incredible film yourself in your own community, in your own living room. You can email the link to the free YouTube video, 60 minutes, to everyone on your email list so that they can know the full range of what we've covered in the last 4 weeks of this webinar series. This week, of course, pyroclastic light clouds, molten steel and iron microspheres, thermite, nanothermite, which we've discussed, and I'm sure we have a few questions about. Next week, of course, we'll go back to, or not next week, but the beginning of September, week 1, back to World Trade Center 7. But before we do, I'm sure we do have some questions. Is that correct, Andy?
Yes, we do. The first question asks if it's possible that the melted metal could have been formed by something the workers did when they were clearing the debris from the site.
Well, the workers were seeing the molten metal, not creating it. They were shocked. The first responders were shocked. They said it's flowing like lava down the channel rails. That's a quote we saw last week, or this week. And so what they did do, they had to cut these beams, of course, and they use oxyacetylene torches. And that can create some slag, certainly, on these beams, but not pools of molten iron. And molten iron is what's discovered here, elemental iron. That persisted for weeks and weeks. This is not something the iron workers were anywhere near able to do. They just had a little bit of slag from their torches. Andy, do you have any other insight on that question?
Basically what you said. There's an interview with Shyam Sundar, who has been mentioned many times in these webinars. We talked about this a few weeks ago here, where he claimed that the temperatures needed to generate the melted steel could have been caused in the pile by having covered fires, and that would increase the temperature. But that overlooks the fact that a fire that's covered is going to be oxygen starved, and it shouldn't get hot enough to melt the steel. So there's a lot of problems with that theory, and I haven't heard anybody come out and say that seriously. It sounded like something that he was kind of hypothesizing on the spot, but I have never heard that pushed by anybody else afterwards, probably because that is a flawed explanation. But no, as Richard says, they were reporting the molten metal more than they were making it. They weren't making it. They were the ones who we got these accounts from.
Yeah, I mean, it was creating massive problems for them. They couldn't get near to many of these areas that had these extremely hot 1300 degree surface temperatures. It kept them from accessing the work that they had to do. And so consequently, the firefighters were pouring a lake of water down there trying to put out these fires, but they're burning underwater. Why? Thermite has its own source of oxygen. It burns just as well underwater.
Right, and I'll also add that you can see the molten metal pouring out of the South Tower before the building comes down. So there were no workers in those buildings causing the metal to turn molten at that moment before the towers came down. So it's not just after the fact; it's during the event as well.
But also, Andy, that's a good point. Some people say, well, that was jet fuel. Well, NIST acknowledges that 90% of the jet fuel burned up outside the towers. The rest was burned in 10 minutes. It just simply lit a fire, much like your lighter fluid in a barbecue. Its purpose is to light the coals, after which we have the fires basically burning out, particularly in the South Tower. But then you have this liquid molten material, which is clearly not, it's very viscous. It's not burning fuel clearly, and nor, as we discussed, could it have been lead or aluminum for the reasons we highlighted.
Exactly. Our next question asks, what's the main characteristic that distinguishes nanothermite from ordinary thermite?
Well, nanothermite, ordinary thermite is merely powdered iron oxide and aluminum powder. These materials are ground down, and they're mixed 3/4 to 1/4, 3/4 iron oxide, which is basically rust, and then they're mixed. That's thermite. You can buy these materials on eBay, and you can ignite them yourself with a very high intensity magnesium strip. And it's quite a show, as you saw in one of these film clips today. But the nanothermite is engineered in only the most sophisticated, advanced defense contracting laboratories from the atomic scale up. You saw the very sophisticated diagram that's involved here. And these materials, this is under laboratory conditions, really. And they are then, as we mentioned, set in this organic bed of oxygen, silica, carbon, and organic material makes it more explosive. So it's a very, very high tech, only made in the last 15, 20 years, before 9/11, clearly 20 years.
Okay, our next question asks, if thermite was used, would there be evidence of the devices that house the thermite left behind?
Well, we've been asked, well, what about the casings of all of these cutter charges? They'd be left behind, they'd be visible, the first responders would have seen them. What we were able to determine and showed you the patented devices for is that some of these types of devices, we showed you an igniter, whose casing is made out of consolidated thermite, so it also would burn up in the process. I don't know why it was made of consolidated thermite, whether that was part of an effort to hide a deception or not, but there it is nevertheless. So it's perfectly capable of burning the casing up, and all that would be left would be molten iron.
Okay, and then our next question asks us, have the people at FEMA pursued the sulfidated steel issue? I think they're referring to Jonathan Barnett or anybody surrounding him in that report, or any independent bodies besides AE911Truth.
Well, the sulfidated steel has been argued about, and the only explanation that's been offered after the FEMA did this, with Jonathan Barnett being the chief author and others like Sisson at the WPI, Worcester Polytechnic Institute, they did this detailed forensic examination of these two pieces of steel. And it is very clear that something happened to these steel, but as the New York Times described, it remains the greatest mystery because they did not pursue it further. To our knowledge, we don't know. We can't write them and request a clarification, a request for correction like we did NIST, because they are not NIST. They're a university, but they have been asked these questions, and to the best of my knowledge, there's been no inspiring responses. Are you aware of any yet, Andy?
I haven't heard anything too inspiring from NIST or very truthful.
Or FEMA or Jonathan Barnett.
Right. So no, that's why we exist, and that's why we are bringing this evidence to you every week, because these are very good questions and things that should have been pursued back when the investigations were done, but weren't for whatever reason. And we'll be charitable and leave it at that. This question just came in. I think this is going to be our last one today. It asks, given that only a small number of high-tech labs are capable of producing nanothermite, surely the source of the material is easily traceable?
I would imagine. We certainly want an investigation of all of the U.S. agencies and U.S. corporations and foreign corporations who have the capability of producing nanothermite. This is one among those targets that a real investigation must be focused on. An investigation that looks exactly who made this stuff. How about the security company at the World Trade Center, under whose noses would have had to have been brought several tons of this, given that the number of microspheres in the dust samples amounts to about 10 tons overall of the evidence of ignited nanothermite. That the amount of chips is 5 to 10 tons. That's unignited nanothermite chips. Obviously, some of it or most of it ignited. So we're talking about dozens and dozens of tons of this material. So we want an investigation of Securicom, Stratosec, the company who had the security contract up until the day of 9/11, interestingly enough. And we want an investigation of the ACE elevator, who had the modernization, largest modernization. They came out of nowhere to get this contract from Otis, and they secured the largest elevator modernization in history, which was going on the 9 months prior to 9/11, which could have allowed, of course, dozens of operatives undercover to place and plant these explosives. That's speculation, but it certainly warrants an investigation, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Richard, you up for one more question that just came in? All right. And I'll put it up on the screen for you yourself. But it asks, does nanothermite account for the pulverized concrete?
I don't think so. And I don't think, I only say that because what we know about nanothermite is that it is primarily an incendiary. Yes, it has been engineered to become more explosive. And I don't have a technical opinion on this because this is not in the field of architecture. But those who analyze this, the 8 authors of the active materials in the World Trade Center dust paper, which analyze this material, suggest they don't know how explosive this is. Yes, 90,000 tons of concrete was pulverized in midair. Did nanothermite do that? Well, some speculate that it might have if it were sprayed on the bottom side of the slabs of the World Trade Center towers, 110 floors of which these slabs were pulverized, under the guise of a fireproofing modernization, which was also going on, as Kevin Ryan documents in his blog called Dig Within. He documents the floors that received this fireproofing upgrade were interestingly associated with the floors respectively in the first tower and the second tower that were hit by planes. So the south tower, of course, was hit lower. So the floors above and below that tower were coincidentally upgraded with fireproofing. The floors in the north tower, which were hit about 15 stories down, were upgraded with fireproofing in the 5 or so floors above and below that floor, or that area hit by the plane. So it's another target of investigation, and on our part, a speculation that this may have been a deceptive fireproofing upgrade that could have been sprayed on a liquid applied fireproofing, because these nanothermite chips are dual layered, and indicating that they were applied fluidly in stages. Some of them have 3 layers. So it needs to be investigated. Did it have the capability of pulverizing that concrete? We don't know. Was there evidence that high energy explosives were used? We think so, because remember last week we discovered 4-ton structural steel sections blown laterally out of each of these towers, 60 miles an hour, thousands of them, landing up to 600 feet in every direction. This is probably evidence of high energy explosives in that case. So we have a mix of things, it appears.
Okay, well, that's going to conclude our webinar for today. I want to thank everybody for coming and watching this. Please spread it around to others, particularly if you know people in the building trades industry. We want them to see it. We're going to be doing this again on Thursday. Richard will have more details about that. But once again, thank you, and we'll see you next week.
And don't forget to come next week on Thursday, September 1st. And that is indeed coming right up, where we start again with week 1. What happened at the World Trade Center with an overview. Week 2 will go into depth, and you can share the results of week 4 today with your friends. This very seminar will be uploaded to YouTube within minutes after we conclude here in a few seconds, which we're going to do right now. But next week, we'll go September 1st, Thursday, back to week 1, and we'll see you then. Thanks so much, everybody. Bye-bye.